I want to say thanks to Dr. Lupieri for inviting me to talk about this topic with all of you. Thanks to all of you who have expressed interest. I know there are several of you here who are not a part of the class. And thanks to all of you who are a part of the class for letting us kind of crash the party and take over for a day. Hopefully it will be an interesting topic for us, an interesting discussion. Slavery in early Christianity has been something that I've been really interested in for quite a while. I think it's a very interesting topic. I think it's particularly relevant today, which is something that we will hopefully discuss more towards the end of our time. As a way of introducing myself to the several of you who I don't know or who don't know me, I came to the study of the New Testament by a somewhat circuitous route. I started off at a small Bible college studying biblical studies, Christian theology. And then I went from there after I finished that program to a state school to study classics, classical languages and literature and culture. I went from there in 2011 to Notre Dame and got an MA in early Christian studies, which is a really kind of interesting thing. If you were to ask the folks at Notre Dame what early Christian studies means, I'm not convinced that they could tell you. So when I got there, they just said, take classes that seem interesting to you and we'll pay for it. So if you ever find that sort of master's program, you should definitely do it because it was a really wonderful time. I spent a lot of time doing Gospels courses and a lot of time studying kind of first century history. And particularly, of course, on slavery in Greco-Roman antiquity with Dr. Bradley, which was just very formative for me. So we'll see a lot of that in the next hour or so. Like Dr. Lupieri said, I'm a candidate in the PhD program in New Testament and early Christianity here at Loyola. And my dissertation is in progress and entitled Slavery, the Enslaved, and the Gospel of Matthew. When we first started the project, the idea was to talk about slavery in all of the Synoptics. And after diving into that for a little while, we decided that that was way too much for a dissertation. How we decided it's too much for a dissertation, but it is small enough to fit in 2.5 hours, is beyond me. So we will try to cover as much ground as we can today. My interest in my study of the Gospels has been influenced a lot by my work with classics and history, and I really, really am interested in the cultural backgrounds and the context of these works. I want to circle back for just a minute to the ministry degree, the degree I started with that I finished in 2007. I finished that and pursued other academic degrees, but I think it's worth noting with a number of Jesuits in the class and a few other priests in the room that it's also maybe relevant that I went on from that degree to practice vocational ministry. I've served in located vocational ministry since 2007. I was ordained in a Protestant tradition in 2011. So even though I approach this subject as a biblical scholar, I am very aware of, I'm very interested in some of the pastoral questions, the pastoral concerns that these texts bring forward, especially in our current kind of cultural moment. I even recently, in response to some of the things going on in our country, wrote a short primer on the subject of ancient slavery, specifically for pastors or priests who are kind of struggling with some of the texts in the New Testament, especially that deal with slavery, that talk about slavery, and how they kind of think about those texts today. So I'm happy to come back to talk about that more and to share that with those of you who may be interested. So that's enough about me. I want to kind of spoil the main point for the day right up front. So as we think about and talk about slavery in the Synoptics, the Synoptic Gospels not only contain numerous references to slaves and slavery, which often enough get missed because of the way we translate these texts, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But these Gospels are also largely content, it would seem, to accept the prevailing cultural view on slavery in the ancient world, which is a view that deprives the enslaved persons of power, of honor, and of human dignity. So as a basic outline of what we're going to do today, we're going to start with a short apology or defense for why we're talking about slavery at all in the Synoptic Gospels course. I want to introduce you to ancient slavery, to some of the works that I think are the most helpful or the best studies on slavery in the first century Mediterranean world, among the Romans especially, but also among the Jewish population and those who identify as Christians, whether they are of Jewish background or Gentile background. And then before the break, I want to spend some time on one story that is found in all four of the Gospels that features an enslaved character. Compare the four tellings and to think about together and discuss, hopefully, how slavery is presented in that story, in those texts specifically. That should put us around noon Central Time. So that is the time for our break. We'll take about 10 minutes to breathe and break, whatever that looks like. And then when we come back for the second half, I want to spend some more time looking at text and talking about some texts together that feature enslaved characters or other images of slavery. So we'll look at a miracle story that's found in both Matthew and Luke, look at a parable or two, at least one of the slavery metaphors that Jesus uses in his other teachings. And then we'll circle around at the end to the question, what does this mean in our present cultural moment? Which again, I think is pretty relevant both in academic circles and also in pastoral circles. Just to give you a quick, to talk about some details. For Zoom specifically, I would love to kind of address the questions you have as we go. I think with such a large group, the easiest way for us to do that is I will stop every once in a while and ask if there are particular questions about things that we've covered. And if you click on the little participants button, there's a hand raise feature, which I can see over here to my left. So if you have a question or comment that you'd like to make, feel free to use that. But also just as we're going, if there are questions that come up that you don't want to forget, that you want to ask, you can feel free to type those in the little chat window. There's also the button at the bottom there that says chat, and I can also see those as they come in. So as we go, if you have questions and you want to type them in to the chat, you can please feel free to do that, and I will hopefully see as many of those as I can and address those as we go. But we'll also have opportunities to stop and discuss together, and the easiest way to make that work is to use the hand raise feature, and we'll kind of use that to keep us all together and somewhat organized. I also, just as a last kind of, I'll see if I can find it here. I have so many things going on the screen. As a last note before we keep going, I do have put together a PDF of several of the texts that we're going to be looking at, talking about. I will have them on the screen as well, but if you want to be able to kind of look at them at your own pace or to scroll back and forth between different things, I'm going to put a link in the chat right now that is would bring you to that PDF. So if you want to look straight at the PDF, you can do that, and I will make it available, a link available in the chat right now. So if you were to click that link, it would bring you to, or copy it and put it in your browser, it would bring you to a PDF that's all the text that we're going to be looking at. So, why are we talking about slavery in the Synoptics course at all? I mentioned before that I am writing a dissertation on slavery in Matthew, and I cannot count the number of times that I have told people that, and I can see on their face this kind of confused look, like they're kind of the wheels are spinning, because they're trying to think of any place in Matthew where slaves or slavery come up. I grew up, like a lot of people in kind of evangelical Protestant churches, using the NIV translation of the Bible, the New International Version, which came out in 1984, was updated in 2011, which is, in the English-speaking world, the best-selling Bible translation right now. So it's a very commonly used Bible translation. And in that translation of the Bible, the word slave only appears twice in all three Synoptic Gospels combined, once in Matthew and once in Mark. Here at Catholic University, maybe it's more appropriate to look at the New American Bible, which was revised in 2011, I believe, also, which is the Bible that is kind of approved for use in liturgy and other places like that. And in the New American Bible, slave appears 12 times, a combined 12 times in the three Synoptics, 6 times in Matthew, 5 times in Luke. just once in Mark. And that's not a lot. But compare those numbers, twice in the NIV, 12 times in the New American Bible. Compare that to the Greek text of the Gospels, which have, the Synoptics have words that ought to be translated as slave or slavery or that sort of word, 73 times. 37 times in Matthew, 31 times in Luke, and an additional 30 words or so, which depending on context may be translated as slave or may be translated as something else. So nearly 100 times between the three Synoptic Gospels in the Greek text, we have words that refer to enslaved characters or slavery-related topics. So we're not talking about a couple isolated incidents. We might think if we were only using the NIV text or the NAB text, that these slave texts are fairly isolated, that they don't come up very often, that slavery is not a very prevalent topic in the Synoptics. But when we look at the Greek text, we see anywhere from 75 to 100 times enslaved characters or concepts of slavery come up in those texts. So just not a few isolated incidents. In Matthew and Luke especially, less so in Mark, which doesn't have a ton of slave terminology. Enslaved persons show up in the overarching narrative at key places. They show up in Jesus' parables. They figure into Jesus' other kind of metaphorical teachings. There are 21 unique pericopes, unique stories in the Synoptics that include enslaved characters or slave images. 37 stories if you count all the parallels. And those, if you're looking at the PDF, are that table on the first page shows you where all of those stories are. We may look at that in just a minute. So slavery is fairly prevalent in the Synoptic text, and that begs the question for me, if it is so prevalent, then why don't we talk about it? Why don't we think about slavery and the enslaved when we're looking at the Synoptic Gospels or when we're looking at the New Testament more broadly? And I think there are two reasons that we can think about for why that may be the case. The first is the matter of translation, which I've already talked about. A number of popular and influential translations of the Bible in English prefer to talk euphemistically about enslaved persons or slavery. That is, they use terms like servant instead of slave. There might be a number of reasons that translation committees would make this type of decision, and to give them the benefit of the doubt, we might think, of some of the older translations that were influenced a lot by the Latin Vulgate. And in the Latin Vulgate, servus is often used as the word for slave. The Latin servus is a cognate of the English servant, so they'd see the parallel there and maybe choose servant because of the close kind of verbal connection to the Latin. Newer translations are, I think, in some ways rightly concerned with being culturally and racially sensitive, would shy away from terms like slave, which we can imagine come with a great deal of baggage, particularly in the United States. But even if there are good reasons not to use the word slave in translation, I think that there are some very good reasons that we should use the term slave in these translations, even if it's uncomfortable. And for this point, I would turn to an article that was written by Clarice Martin, who's a womanist theologian, a womanist biblical scholar. And in 1990, she wrote an article entitled Womanist Interpretations of the New Testament, The Quest for Holistic and Inclusive Translation and Interpretation. So in this article, she discusses at length the translation of the Greek terms doulos and doule, which are the term for slave in the masculine and feminine. And you'll hear me say those words probably several times. Doulos and doule, the masculine and feminine versions of the noun that in Greek means slave. So she notes in this article the importance of faithfully rendering a biblical terminology in English. And more than that, she notes the importance of addressing kind of the ideological impact, the socio-political impact of this biblical terminology. And she asks the question, would it not be better to translate doulos, this Greek word for slave, regularly as the more euphemistic servant? And her response in that article is a resounding no. And she gives two reasons for this. First, she says that doulos, this Greek word, in normal Greco-Roman usage, is generally translated as slave. That servant is consistently used as a translation for doulos only in biblical translation. It is only people who translate the Bible who consistently translate this term as servant. And the distinction between these two words, slave and servant, she finds to be very significant because of the involuntary nature of the service that is rendered by the doulos, which is central to that term's meaning. Second, she says that translating doulos as servant, and this is a quote, she says it minimizes the full psychosocial weight of the institution of slavery itself. And she also writes, I have always been troubled by exegetical arguments and interpretations of slave existence in the Common Era that suggest that ancient slavery was only a sporadically stressful interruption to an otherwise quite normal existence. So to sum up what she says, the use of the English term slave in the New Testament is both more accurate, considering the original meaning of the Greek terms in question, and it also more aptly recognizes the realities of the ancient institution to which these words refer back. So Martin, as a womanist writer, as a womanist biblical scholar, acknowledges the complexity of this question, the question of how we translate these terms, noting the importance of considering how people of color hear such texts. She specifically points to the concern of whether the term slave is somehow offensive to African American readers. The term slave is obviously one that comes with a lot of baggage. One could imagine that the term doulos, the original Greek term, also came with a good bit of baggage. However, Martin concludes, again as a quote, an etymologically faithful reading of doulos is preferred to the more euphemistic reading, even if the motive for the euphemism is purportedly conciliatory. Even if we are leaning towards euphemism because we are trying to be sensitive, she says it is better to translate doulos as slave, to be faithful to what the term itself meant in the ancient world. So why don't we think about and talk about slavery and the enslaved when we're looking at the Synoptic Gospels? First, the matter of translation. Second, there's the matter of interpretation, which I want to spend a little time on. By this, I mean how ancient slavery is understood and represented when it is discussed. And as we look at this, what we're going to see is that older historical views, which have now largely been debunked, which are still influential in New Testament studies. So older historical views that really are no longer accepted among classical and historical scholars are still influential in New Testament studies, and these views often serve to conceal the most uncomfortable elements of ancient slavery. I have heard or read some form of this phrase more often than I can count. Well, slavery in the ancient world wasn't like slavery in America. Well, on the one hand, that's certainly true. There are a number of things that distinguish ancient slavery in the Roman world from antebellum slavery in the United States. The most obvious of which is that slavery in the ancient Mediterranean world doesn't appear to have been racially motivated. The problem is not the comparison. The problem is that this slavery was different back then. Rhetoric is almost universally appealed to in order to say slavery in the ancient world wasn't that bad, which is often an argument made with apologetic motives. That is, if slavery in the ancient world wasn't that bad, we don't need to explain why the Bible never explicitly speaks against it. So as it turns out, older scholarship used to argue this very thing, that slavery in the ancient world was not that bad or that it was benign or even benevolent. But developments in the areas of history, sociology, and classics among those who study Greek and Roman civilization and culture have changed the way that people in those disciplines think about and talk about slavery in the ancient Mediterranean world. Basically, it used to be the consensus among specialists that Roman slavery wasn't that bad, that it was basically benign or even benevolent, and actually provided a number of real benefits to enslaved persons. But that consensus has changed based on newer research that asked different and I think often better questions of the source material. And it changed nearly 40 years ago. So I want to spend some time demonstrating what I see as a very important shift in the consensus that is held by historians and classicists when it comes to the question, what was the nature of slavery in Roman antiquity? And then we'll spend a little time seeing how that may impact our understanding of slavery among Jews and among Christians in the first century, how it changes the way we read certain texts. The older consensus was defined by a more legal definitions of slavery. We'll talk about this in a minute, which among other things took at face value statements about slavery made in legal and literary texts produced in the Roman period. This understanding of slavery was disrupted in the early 80s, early 70s even at some, by several important scholars who would introduce what we'll call more social definitions of slavery, which define the institution as a violently coercive relationship between persons rather than as a set of legal precedents. So before we dive into this, I want to define my terms. I know that Megan would be happy about this. I'm going to use a few terms pretty frequently, and I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page with those things. So if I talk about the old consensus or legal definitions of slavery, which I will sometimes use those two terms interchangeably, what I'm talking about is the now largely outdated idea that slavery in the ancient world was benign or benevolent. So the old consensus, these legal definitions, lead to this idea that ancient slavery was benign. When I talk about a new consensus or social definitions of slavery, those are terms that I use for the really currently accepted idea that slavery in the ancient world was oppressive, violent, and coercive at the institutional level. So the old consensus, legal definitions, slavery in the ancient world wasn't that bad, it was benign or benevolent. The new consensus, social definitions, that ancient slavery was oppressive, violent, coercive, kind of institutionally. And also just briefly, there are two other terms that would be helpful to know. I will use the term manumission fairly frequently. That is just the kind of technical term for freeing someone from slavery or release from slavery. So if someone was manumitted, they were released from slavery. And then I will also, as often as I can, as often as I remember to do so, we'll use the term enslaved persons or the enslaved rather than using the term slave because a number of recent studies point out how that change in terminology helps to maintain the personhood of the individuals who were reduced to slavery in ancient and even modern times. It recognizes that being a slave doesn't make up the whole of that person's identity. So I will still use the term slave, and I kind of insist on the use of the term slave in translation, since that is what these ancient words meant. But when I'm talking about enslaved characters or enslaved persons, I will kind of opt for the terminology that remembers the personhood of these individuals. So the legal definitions, this old consensus view, I want to give you kind of an overview of these things, then we'll look at some texts because texts are more fun than listening to me talk. Scholars throughout the early and mid 20th century kind of set about cataloging the Roman legal code and combing through Roman literature in an attempt to understand the Roman slave system. And I can't throw out these studies. They are impressive in a lot of ways. They are monumental in scope. They're monumental kind of in their methodology and their process. But as a rule, these works assume that the texts from antiquity are descriptive of ancient life. So that means these texts are taken, their words are taken at face value as a description of what life and law were actually like. Now, this is opposed to prescriptive texts or idealistic texts that define the world as the author thinks it should be, as the author kind of wishes it might ideally be. So these early old consensus views read these texts as descriptive, and we'll see when we talk about the new consensus social definitions that they read these texts as prescriptive in some ways. So most of these early scholars tell a similar story about the rise of slavery that goes something like this. As ancient Greece and the ancient Greek and Roman states developed, they required an increased labor force. And they acquired this labor force through enslaving war captives, and then eventually through the natural procreation of these enslaved persons. These people were taught marketable skills. Many of them were freed and became integrated and sometimes wealthy members of free society. Slavery for these scholars is described in terms of a compulsory apprenticeship into an art or a craft, which prepared the enslaved person to live a successful life when they were inevitably freed. These scholars argue that the Romans particularly eventually passed a number of laws which actually protected the rights of the enslaved. And what's more, the Roman system uniquely allowed enslaved persons to climb the social ladder in sometimes unprecedented ways. So all of these things, combined with the kind of egalitarianism that comes with the rise of Stoic philosophy, close bonds that were allegedly felt between masters and the enslaved persons who were born in their homes, and general feelings of altruism towards the enslaved, marks the Roman system as distinctly benign. Certainly, these scholars would argue it was not as harsh as the system that existed in the United States. And I want to name just a couple of the kind of prominent authors from the fields of history and classics who argued for this type of view of slavery, because we'll see these authors pop up in New Testament studies. So, for instance, Buckland, who wrote in 1908, The Roman Law of Slavery. It's a huge work that just kind of catalogs all of these legal texts. R.H. Barrow, who wrote Slavery in the Roman Empire in 1928. William Westerman, who wrote The Slave Systems of Greek and Roman Antiquity in 1955. Obviously, these are not the only people who wrote on slavery in the early 20th century. But all of these people, Buckland, Barrow, and Westerman, are particularly important in shaping or solidifying this old consensus view for historians, for classicists, as well as for biblical scholars. Buckland, writing in 1908, Barrow, writing in 1928, and Westerman, whose kind of final work is published in 55, are all cited still in a number of relevant modern biblical commentaries. Some commentaries which were written in the last decade, still citing these works from the early 20th century that have now largely been kind of replaced by more modern scholarship that critiques these older views. So the social definitions, this new consensus that I think is important to bring towards or bring into New Testament texts as people are starting to bring into New Testament texts, goes something like this. In the 1970s, and even more so in the early 80s, scholars began to challenge the tenets of this old consensus and to move away from these legal definitions of slavery. These scholars, I think, helpfully recognize that there's a methodological danger in describing the slave system of the past using words written by the slave-holding class. They begin reading these ancient texts more critically or maybe more suspiciously, recognizing that they were written, many of them consciously written, in order to maintain the slave system. So by acknowledging, by calling out the biases and the prejudices of the freeborn elite authors in these source texts, these scholars come to the recognition that the Roman slave system is an oppressive institution maintained by coercion and violence. Those wanting to grapple with this new consensus on Roman slavery ought to know, in my opinion, at least these three names: Moses Finley, Orlando Patterson, and Dr. Keith Bradley, who's with us today. Moses Finley first suggested in a book on a totally different topic. He has a book on the ancient economy that came out in 1973. But he suggests in that book, in a very short section, I think it's only like 6 pages, a short section on slavery, that historians need to consider the individual enslaved person's experience of slavery. Particularly, he says, the separation of the slave from homeland and kin, the implications of the ubiquitous term boy as a form of address for male slaves of any age, and the impact on sexual mores brought about by a slave's total sexual availability to his or her master. Finley confronts a number of works, particularly the work of Westerman that I mentioned before. Westerman was Finley's teacher. But Westerman and others, all of whom he says base their descriptions of ancient slavery on exceptional cases or on silence in the source text. They argue from things that the text don't talk about. He also importantly reminds the reader that Roman literary materials represent the views and hopes of the slave-owning class, not of enslaved persons themselves. And they can provide evidence only for what he calls the ideology of the free. In 1982, Orlando Patterson wrote a book called Slavery and Social Death, in which he compares the commonalities between the world's 5 historical genuine slave societies, which is a term I believe he gets from Finley, in order to define universal facets of slavery as an institution. And he concludes that slavery, regardless of time or place, is defined by violent domination, the severing of family and ethnic ties, and dishonor. His definition for slavery is, I think, maybe the most succinct that has been published, and is, for me, a fair summary of this new consensus view. So you will hear me say it several times, but he writes at the beginning of this work that slavery is the permanent, violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. So I think a very helpful definition, a very helpful and succinct way to understand what this new consensus says about slavery. That's the permanent, violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. At around the same time that Patterson was writing, 1984, Keith Bradley wrote Slaves and Masters in the Roman Empire, a study in social control, in which he argues, like Finley and Patterson, that the Roman slave system as a whole was by nature oppressive and was maintained for the benefit of the privileged only, as opposed to these old consensus views that talk about the benefits given to slaves by the system. He argues against the prevailing idea from earlier scholarship that the enslaved enjoyed relatively secure family lives, that they could expect to be freed or they could expect manumission, and that they were easily compelled to complete the work that was set before them. He argues instead that owners encouraged family life among the enslaved as a means of manipulating their behavior. Similarly, manumission was promised and was often enough given as a reward for faithful service in order to maintain compliance among the enslaved population. And when these methods failed, masters had the legal authority to resort to more violent forms of manipulation. So a number of historians beyond these 3 have continued to parse out the implications of this new understanding of slavery for life in the Roman world, building on the foundations that are laid by Finley, Patterson, Bradley, and a number of other important early scholars. This new consensus on social definitions for slavery, although it allows for the varied experience of individual enslaved persons, recognizes the violent and coercive nature of Roman slavery as an institution. Slavery was maintained solely for the benefit of slaveholders. The many benefits for the enslaved that had previously been identified were simply methods utilized by the slaveholder to maintain control. These benefits were by far outweighed by slavery's dehumanizing elements. Dr. Bradley concludes one of his works on slavery with this sentence, which I think is very helpful. Slavery represents the polar opposite of everything laudable in Greco-Roman civilization, as an abomination for which no apology is possible and in which no redeeming features can be found. So as a demonstration of these 2 different views, this old consensus, legal definitions, new consensus, social definitions, and how each of these might approach the ancient literature, I want you to consider an example that's given by J. Albert Harrell, who is a New Testament scholar who does some amazing things with slavery in Christian texts, the New Testament and otherwise. He cites a letter written by Pliny the Younger, a Roman author, and says, in the old consensus view, based on these legal definitions, Pliny's letter is thought about in this way. It says, Pliny describes how he spares no expense in the care and treatment of the enslaved Encolpius, his lector, so it's one of his slaves who reads his literary works, who has become ill. The surface reading, he argues, might portray Pliny as a caring, fatherly figure who shows great concern for this enslaved individual. And an old consensus view, these legal definition kind of based views, will look at this letter and see, look at how much the master in this letter cares for the enslaved person. That must be kind of typical of Roman slavery as a whole. Harrell argues, on the other hand, that a more skeptical reading, the type of reading accepted by or used by these new consensus scholars, a more skeptical reading of the same text suggests that Pliny's true concerns in all of this are for himself and for his own literary works. He quotes part of this letter where it writes that the illness of Encolpius, quote, will be a great loss to me, Pliny, the author, if this makes him unfit for his services to literature. So in this view, in this more skeptical reading of Pliny's letter, Encolpius needs to be healthy, the slave needs to be healthy for Pliny's sake. If this enslaved person cannot be brought back to health, Pliny's own literary output will be hampered, and that is the real problem here. I want to look at just a few more texts because I think they're interesting, and I'm going to put them up on the screen for us to look at because I think it's important to recognize that even though these new consensus or social definitions talk about slavery as an institution being violent and coercive, it also has to deal with the fact that ancient slavery is very diverse. And so this is a number of examples from Harrell and from Bradley that are taken from the ancient world that give us kind of a number of interesting pictures of what ancient slave life might have been like. So we're going to look at these texts. I'll put them up on the screen here. Let me just do this. So the first comes from a letter which is sent to Cicero, who is someone you may or may not have heard of, by his brother Quintus in 53 BCE. And the letter goes like this: "My dear Marcus, as I hope to see you again, and my boy, and my Loyola, and your son, I am truly grateful for what you have done about Tiro, in judging his former condition to be below his deserts, and preferring us to have him as a friend rather than a slave. Believe me, I jumped for joy when I read your letter and his. Thank you and congratulations." So the Tiro who is mentioned in this letter was an enslaved member of the household whom Cicero had recently seen fit to free, improving his station to freedman and citizen. He was a cultured individual. He had considerable capacity for literature. There's all sorts of interesting things written about Tiro. And the manumission of Tiro, his freedom and his elevation in status, was, it would appear at least, a source of joy, great joy for Quintus. The next image comes from the eastern province of Pamphylia. The enslaved person in question is not being freed, but is rather being sold. So a papyrus fragment, a documentary papyrus fragment, reads as follows. "In the consulship of L. Cuspius Rufinus and L. Statius Quadratus, at side before L. Claudius Auspicatus, demiurge and priest of the goddess Roma, on the 26th of Loos, Pamphilos, otherwise known as Canopos, son of Aegyptos, from Alexandria, has purchased in the marketplace from Artemidorus, son of Aristocles, the slave girl Abascantis, or by whatever other name she may be known, a 10-year-old Galatian, for the sum of 280 silver denarii. M. alias Gavianus stands surety for and guarantees the sale. The girl is healthy, in accordance with the edict of the aediles, is free of liability in all respects, is prone neither to wandering nor running away, and is free of epilepsy." So while the precise circumstances of this girl's life before and after her sale can't be accurately reconstructed, this bill of sale tells us that she was taken from her native land, Galicia, to the coastal city of Side and was sold there to a man who was a native Egyptian, perhaps taken back to Alexandria, perhaps not. The details of her life beyond her place of origin and her overall health and fitness to serve her new master are deemed irrelevant. The third image comes from a commemorative inscription dedicated to Musicus Scaranus, an enslaved man who was serving in the imperial household. So the inscription says this: "To the deserving Musicus Scaranus, slave of Tiberius Caesar Augustus, accountant of the Gallic treasury in the province of Gallia Lugdunensis, from those of his under-slaves who were with him when he died at Rome." So this enslaved person, Musicus Scaranus, even though he was enslaved, seems to have enjoyed a position of influence, had a personal retinue of enslaved individuals at his disposal. The inscription continues to list the names and functions of 16 other enslaved individuals who seemed to work for or under Scaranus. So in a lot of ways, this person's life may have been seen as privileged and as highly successful. And then in juxtaposition with this comfortable and successful life that may have been possible for people like Scaranus, who are part of the imperial household, sometimes called the Familia Caesaris, we have an image taken from the digest of Justinian. So we've seen the papyrus earlier on about Abascantis, the little girl. And the end of that text said that she was in good health. There was a requirement in Roman law that the seller of a slave must declare whether that enslaved person was defective in any way, was unhealthy or unfit. So consequently, we have this text in the digest from the jurist Ulpian. The question arises whether one whose tongue has been cut out is healthy. The problem is dealt with by Ophilius in respect to a horse. His opinion is in the negative, that is, they are not healthy. So this text from Ulpian highlights two aspects of Roman slavery. First, the legal issue in question demonstrates the level of violence that at least some portion of the servile population might expect from particularly brutal masters. And second, the fact that the legal decision regarding the enslaved person is settled by a similar ruling made in respect to a horse demonstrates a certain attitude towards the individual and their humanity, or lack thereof. Adding to these examples, especially to be read alongside the success of Musicus Scaranus, the enslaved person in Tiberius' household, Harrell gives several examples of highly placed individuals, highly placed enslaved persons, still facing a great deal of violence or personal physical danger. Taken from Suetonius' Life of Augustus. He lists in that text the enslaved individual named Cosmos, who's put in chains, a recently freed person named Paulus, who's forced to commit suicide, and then two other likely enslaved persons, the secretary Thallus and the pedagogue Gaius, the former who has his legs broken for accepting a bribe, and the latter who was thrown into a river with weights tied around his neck. Harrell concludes that slaves are subject to corporal punishment, they are limited in power, and they exist solely at the whim of the master, so that any honor of position, any privileged position that an enslaved person might be given, is not the same as being given aristocratic dignity. So these examples are all offered to highlight specifically one element that you have to keep in mind when thinking about Roman slavery in antiquity, that the institution of slavery was exceptionally complex. Within these examples, we have someone being freed and also someone being sold to a place far away from their home. We have someone achieving success, at least financially, materially, and others who are facing terrible physical violence. These features, even though they seem contradictory, are able to coexist in the Roman slave system. The same system that allowed Tiro, to be freed by Cicero, also allowed a 10-year-old girl to be taken far from her home. The institution that allowed musicus curanus to enjoy wealth and prestige and privilege also allowed some nameless enslaved persons to be punished in severe and humiliating ways. So Bradley says, the Roman slave system cannot be understood without at once acknowledging its enormous diversity and variability. Any attempt to define its general features must constantly allow for the unanticipated and the exceptional. So even though all of these texts that we've looked at, all of these examples that we've looked at, have been taken from the secular Roman world, we could easily compile a similar list of texts that illustrate the difficulty of talking about attitudes towards slavery among first century Christians or Jewish communities. Consider the following images of slavery, which are all taken from the New Testament. In Luke 7, a slave of a certain centurion who was valuable to him was ill and about to die. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and cure his slave. In Matthew 24, the slave's master will come on an unexpected day and at an unknown hour and will cut him in two and assign him a place with the hypocrites where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Galatians 3, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is not male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. In Ephesians 6, slaves, be obedient to your human masters as to Christ, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, not only when being watched so as to curry favor, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, willingly serving the Lord and not human beings. I present these texts primarily to highlight the complexity of the question of slavery. In these few texts that we've looked at from the New Testament, we see one master, a centurion, who is perhaps looking out for the well-being of an enslaved individual, who may be looking out for his own economic well-being. We'll look at that text more closely after the break. And another master bringing down tremendously harsh punishment, being cut in half. A lot of translations say punished severely, but the Greek term is quite literally cut in two. In some of the letters, we have texts that portray Christian association as egalitarian, a place where enslaved persons live as equals with those of higher social status. But other texts that seem to reinforce the place of the enslaved person beneath the master by equating obedience to the earthly master with obedience to Christ. Nowhere in the New Testament do we find a definitive statement on the appropriate Christian response to the pervasive institution of slavery. And including later Christian material in this exploration serves only to make the picture more complicated. Consider just a couple things. John Chrysostom, who wrote at the end of the 4th century, the beginning of the 5th century, in a sermon on 1 Thessalonians, warns his congregation that they should not have sexual relationships with the people who they enslave. And he expects, it would seem from the text, that that declaration would disturb his listeners. There's also the example from material culture of a number of slave collars which have been found, collars which were used to keep particularly troublesome slaves from running away. A number of those have been found that bear Christian iconography, the Chi Rho or the Alpha Omega. There is one that was discovered that reads, "I am the slave of the Archdeacon Felix, hold me so that I do not flee." And looking at Jewish material from outside the Christian tradition yields similarly complex results. If we look at texts that come from time before the New Testament that are often used to talk about or to describe what Jewish slavery might have been like in the 1st century, we see a number of legal texts in the Hebrew Bible that suggest that Jews who are enslaved by other Jews, which are usually referred to as the Hebrew slaves in the biblical and rabbinic texts, should be released at regular intervals every 7 years. But there are other biblical texts, particularly in the prophets, Jeremiah and Nehemiah, which may suggest that this regular manumission didn't commonly take place. Josephus, when he writes about the Jews, says that a number of Jews were reduced to slavery by the Seleucid kings in Bellum Judaicum and some other places, but also records accounts of the Hasmonean and Herodian kings enslaving the people whom they conquered. John Hyrcanus is said to enslave the inhabitants of Sebast when he conquers it, also in Bellum Judaicum. In reference to the Essenes, a Jewish group, Josephus says that they did not participate in slavery at all. But there are other texts found at the Dead Sea, which may or may not be connected to the Essenes, that give these types of kind of monastic Jewish groups, if I can use the term, instructions on how to deal with their slaves in their community. And we also see, in contrast to these Essenes, a number of passages from the rabbinic material that say Rabbi Gamaliel not only accepted slavery, but was a slave owner himself. In Ben Sira, we read that enslaved persons require only bread and discipline and work, but that those enslaved persons who cause particular problems for their owner may also receive racks and torture. Again, very complicated, complex pictures portrayed by all these texts. So any definition of slavery, any answer to the question, what did ancient slavery look like in any of our varied contexts, has to allow for the complexities that are demonstrated in the text that we've just briefly seen. But it also has to take all of this evidence seriously. The older consensus, the legal definitions, tend to focus on enslaved persons like Encolpius, this poor, sick lector whom Pliny showed genuine concern for. They focus on Tiro, the dear slave of Cicero, who was given the freedom he so richly deserved. They focus on individuals like Musicus Scaranus, for whom slavery became a path to great financial success. But I do not think that these older views adequately explain how a 10-year-old girl being taken from her homeland can be described as benevolent. I don't think they adequately explain how such demeaning punishments as having one's tongue cut out or one's legs broken ultimately helps integrate the violated person into free society. I don't think they adequately explain the physical and sexual violence that enslaved persons are vulnerable to, which is mentioned as a matter of course in so many sources. And as it turns out, classicists and historians for the better part of 4 decades agree and have accepted the new consensus based on social definitions of slavery. Slavery in the ancient world should be rightly understood, as Patterson said, as the permanent violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. So to say that slavery was permanent is not to say that slaveholders couldn't choose to manumit enslaved persons. They certainly could and did. Rather, it means that slaveholders were under no compulsion to do so. There was no expectation, no requirement that they had to free slaves at any point. To say that slavery is characterized by violent domination is not to say that every slave in the ancient world was subjected to violence, physical violence, sexual violence, emotional violence, etc. Rather, it means that such violence may be brought against a slave at any time by the person enslaving them or even by others. Slaves were not always violated, but the threat of violence was always present for ancient slaves, regardless of any high position that they might achieve. When we say that slavery is characterized by natal alienation, that's not to say that every slave was separated from their family or restricted from the semblance of family life. Rather, it means that the family connections of enslaved individuals didn't have to be respected, and they were not protected by law. And when we say that slavery was characterized by general dishonor, that's not to say that enslaved persons were never given the respect that they deserved as human persons. We have examples like Tiro, who we noted above. Even though that example shouldn't be idealized, we have another letter written by Quintus to Tiro that starts out, "I have beaten you," and it goes on to say, "I've beaten you with my silence because you don't write back to me." But But to say to a former slave who may have suffered actual physical beatings after they've been freed to start a letter to them with "I have beaten you" is tasteless, to say nothing else. Rather, it means that unlike free persons, the honor, the dignity of enslaved persons was not respected or protected as a matter of law and could be violated at any time by almost any person without hope for redress. The same Cicero who freed Tiro in one of his other letters talks about having 120,000 sesterces, it's a kind of money value, on the platform when he's talking about slaves that he's selling. He doesn't even refer to them as persons. He refers to them as a stack of money. Dehumanization seems to be the accepted norm. So our sources present a complicated picture of ancient slavery, but the picture on the whole is not a good one. One might become enslaved in a variety of ways, captured in war, born to an enslaved mother, exposed as an infant, kidnapped by pirates or brigands. One might be forced to serve in a variety of ways, in agricultural settings, domestic settings, a combination of the two, even high-level bureaucratic settings. The quality of life experienced by enslaved persons varied greatly. The same institution that allows for people like Scaranus to become the master of the Gallic treasury also allows for violation, alienation, and dehumanization. So that is the picture of slavery that we're working with, that we're dealing with. We will not have time. I'm looking for Megan's face, who's probably like tapping her watch. We will not have time to jump into our biblical text before the break. I want to make sure we have time to discuss those. But I do want to suggest quickly 2 questions that we will use based on what I've just said as we discuss these texts moving forward. So as we use the remainder of our time on the gospel text, I want to suggest, based on what we've just said, that we read these texts in a particular way, that we do not give the gospel authors the benefit of the doubt when it comes to how they portray slavery and the enslaved. I want us to curb the impulse to say, well, it's in the Gospels, so there must be some explanation for this thing that I find wholly distasteful. Instead, I want us to ask 2 questions about these texts as we go through. One, what do the texts actually say about slavery or the enslaved? Or maybe to put that a different way, what do the texts tell us about ancient slavery? Jennifer Glancy, who has written a number of very helpful things on slavery in early Christianity and in the New Testament, reminds us that we can learn things about ancient slavery from texts that are actually about something else. So as we look at these texts, what do they tell us about ancient slavery? How do they portray ancient slavery? What do we actually read in these texts? And then the second question is, how do these texts conform to or deviate from the norm that is kind of set up by these social definitions of slavery, like Patterson's? As we read these texts, do we see violent domination? Do we see natal alienation? Do we see general dishonor? Or do we see something else? So those are our 2 questions. What do these texts say about slavery? How do they conform to or deviate from the definitions that historians have come to prefer for ancient slavery? So I want to stop because I've been talking for a very long time. We've got 6-ish minutes left before our break. So I want to give us some time for questions, for comments as we prepare to break and then come at the gospel texts kind of from this direction. So if you would like to use the hand raise feature so we can kind of keep things straight. So I've got, Ian says, I missed the gloss on natally alienated. Could you circle back to that briefly? So natal alienation is this idea that you could be separated from family, from kin. So for enslaved persons, while they were allowed in some cases to have the kind of semblance of family life, there is no requirement that that enslavers keep enslaved families together. So I may, as an enslaved person, have a wife, even though that relationship is not recognized legally. But my master is under no compulsion to keep me and that person together. They could sell her and keep me, sell us both separately. So the family kind of life of enslaved persons is not respected. And they could also be, separated from their homeland. So like the little girl who's taken from Galatia and is sold to an Egyptian. She's been separated from her kind of culture, from her ethnic background, and there is no kind of protection for those relationships. The generational aspect, do you mean people who become enslaved and then their families are kind of subsequently enslaved moving forward? Is that what you mean, Kathy? Yeah, it can be. That's an interesting question, and part of the maybe the difference between the older consensus and the newer consensus is one of the things that the old consensus says is that enslaved persons, have an expectation of being freed around the age of 30. There's a legal text from the early kind of imperial period or principate that says, what it actually says is that slaves should not be freed before they are 30. And this somehow gets, I think, turned around in scholarship, and including in New Testament scholarship, to say that slaves could expect to be freed by 30. And so if one expected to be freed by 30, you can imagine kind of beginning your family life at that point. But if slaves have no expectation of freedom, and if particularly children born of enslaved mothers are themselves enslaved, there is this kind of generational aspect. And in fact, maybe not most, a lot of scholarship that I have read talks about slavery kind of in the earlier periods, as the slave supply, I guess you could say, in the earlier periods, coming a great deal from war captives, but that supply kind of shifting in later periods more towards this kind of generational. Now, I don't know that that's always as much of a kind of cut and dry thing as people make it seem, because Rome does, among other things, carry out a lot of wars, even into the kind of later periods. But it kind of natural generation, or this kind of generational aspect that you talk about, is considered a major source of kind of new enslaved persons. So there is, at least to some element, in some way, a generational kind of aspect. Jacob, I see your question too, but I want to make sure that we respect our break time, because now that I can see Megan's face, she's like looming in a particularly frightening way. We'll take a 10-minute break and then get back together. We will spend the bulk of the second half of our time looking at texts together. So if you want to look at that PDF, I will also have them up on the screen where you can see them. And hopefully we'll be able to talk back and forth a lot more in the second half about what we actually see in these texts, how they do or do not conform to these newer definitions, and then we will go from there. So I have 12:02, so if we come back around 10 after or 12 after, we will get back at it. So thank you so much so far, and we will go on. So what I'm going to do with the rest of our time, what I hope we're able to do with the rest of our time, is to look at some specific texts from the New Testament. I'm going to look at them together. I'll put them up on the screen for all of us to look at. And again, if you want to look at the PDF, I sent that link in the chat a while ago. I wonder if it's still in my... It is. It was still in my... I sent it just to one person. That was unhelpful. Sorry, Deborah. Send it to everybody. So if you want to follow that link and look at that PDF or even download it, you can. It just has the texts that we're going to look at together right now. But the first page of that PDF, which I will throw up on the screen here for a second, is a table that I put together when I first started this project, back when I still was under the mistaken impression that I'd be doing all the synoptics. And this is every text except maybe one in the Synoptic Gospels where slave terminology shows up. And it shows, you can see the parallels there, kind of set across from each other. It is organized kind of canonically through Matthew, and then things that are distinct to Mark or Luke will appear further down at the bottom, you can see. So that is the first page of that, but then it goes on to kind of the text that I want us to look at together. So I will have it up on my screen, which I'm also going to take over here for a second. Sorry, boom. So when we look at these texts, like I said, what I want us to do is ask those two questions. What do these texts actually say about slaves or slavery, about the enslaved persons that show up? And then how do these texts conform to or deviate from the norm that is kind of set by these social definitions that say that slavery is violent, that it is dishonor upon the enslaved person, that sort of thing. The first text that I want us to look at is actually in all four Gospels. It's a text, it's a story, maybe I should say, that is probably familiar to all of us. And so we'll start out with that. It is the one that's labeled 1.1 on that sheet, if you're looking at it, from the story of Jesus' arrest. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to open it up and just ask for kind of what you see in this text where it relates to slaves or slavery. And we'll kind of do that as we go through the different versions of the story. So Mark writes this, immediately while he was still speaking, he being Jesus, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew a sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." All of them deserted him and fled. And then, because you can't stop at this point, you got to keep reading. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. If you're that close, you may as well read it. It's a hilarious story. So looking at this text, where do we see slavery, and what do we see happening? You can just jump in, or you can put it in the chat however you want. So yeah, we have this slave of the high priest, and this tells us a couple things maybe, who shows up with the mob and has his ear cut off. That is a fairly minor detail in this story, but it says an awful lot. The slave belongs to the high priest, which tells us, if nothing else, Mark believes it possible for a kind of religious Jewish official to own a slave. The slave shows up out of the crowd, which I think is super interesting, which we might talk about later. And the slave is physically assaulted by someone who is described in this text as near Jesus, presumably one of Jesus' disciples. So we have a slave, an enslaved person, owned by a Jewish individual, best we can tell, who's assaulted in the garden. What is the response to that assault in this text? Mark gives us this story. Verse 47, the one who stood near drew his sword, struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. But then verse 48 continues as if nothing ever happened. I mean, you could cut out verse 47 and this text would make total sense. The crowd shows up, Judas kisses Jesus, they arrest him, and then Jesus responds. You wouldn't even know that the slave existed if verse 47 wasn't there, because we hear that there's a crowd earlier on, verse 43, but we don't actually hear that the slave is a part of that crowd until it comes time for the slave to be attacked. Working on Matthew, and this is maybe a side point, but I find that really, really interesting. My work in Matthew focuses specifically on people who are explicitly identified as enslaved persons. But this detail, that there is this crowd, and we only find out about the slave when it's time for that person to be attacked, is very, very interesting to me, because even though slaves only show up 30 or 40 times in Matthew, there are almost 50 crowds, which begs the question, how many of those crowds may have also had enslaved persons in them who are not talked about, which I think is really interesting. I don't think we can ever know the answer to that question, but there it is. So we have in this version of the story, a slave belonging to the high priest who's present in the crowd, who's physically assaulted by someone near Jesus, and nothing is said or done about it at all. There is no response to this attack. Best we know, Mark leaves the enslaved person bleeding in the garden. That's it. So we move on from there. We can compare that to three other versions of the story that appear in Matthew, Luke, and John. I have not given the full story from Matthew. This is just the part of the story that deals with the enslaved individual. So the beginning of the story is largely the same in Matthew. It's very close to what Mark does. So this basically replaces Mark 14:47. So instead of that really short story, we have this. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way?" So we have a lot of things that are similar. We have an enslaved person. We have an enslaved person who's owned by the high priest, whose ear is cut off. But what we have that's different from Mark is a response. The ear is cut off, and Jesus actually responds to that event. So how does Jesus respond to that event here? What does he talk about? Because I think this is really interesting too. Or maybe a better way to ask the question is, does Jesus actually respond to the slave's injury? Or does he respond to something else? Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? He says to the disciple, he says, "Put your sword away, because all who take up the sword, like this disciple just has, will perish by the sword." He doesn't say anything about the victims of violence. He seems to talk about the perpetrator of violence and what will happen to them. So he really addresses this disciple. He doesn't say much of anything to the enslaved individual. It's the same thing Abby just said in the chat. Jesus responds to violence, but not to the person who was kind of subjected to that violence. And then he moves on in 53, a little dyslexic there. "Don't you think I can appeal to my Father, and he will send more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled?" So Jesus goes from talking about kind of this disciple and this disciple's use of violence and the use of violence in general, and how that can turn around on the person who uses violence, to talking about himself, his own kind of fate, and how Scripture should be fulfilled, which will be a pretty common theme if you've read Matthew. Matthew is very interested in the fulfillment of Scripture. So Matthew does add a response to this event, a response that he doesn't find in Mark, but he uses that opportunity to talk about kind of what it means to perpetrate violence and how that will come back on the offender. He uses it as an opportunity to talk about Jesus and the fulfillment of prophecies, which is a big theme for Matthew. But what he doesn't do is actually address the injury. So let's look at Luke. Somebody mentioned Luke already when they said that in one of the Gospels there is this kind of direct intervention by Jesus. So Luke, again, starts very similar to Mark. Same crowd shows up. There are some kind of minor differences in the early telling of the story. And then we have in 22:49, when those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, "Lord, should we strike with the sword?" Then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this," and he touched his ear and healed him. So there's a very direct response in Luke to this attack. And I think that this is maybe the most interesting slave passage in the entire Gospel of Luke. Because in a lot of other ways, Luke is very similar to Matthew, particularly in the way it talks about and the way it deals with slaves and slavery, which we'll look at more. But specifically in this instance, Luke finds in Mark that there is no response to this attack. Luke may have seen Matthew. I know that depending on how you understand the composition of these works, Maybe Matthew did see Luke, and maybe Luke did see Matthew, maybe he didn't, which I know you talked about a few weeks ago. But if Luke has read Matthew, he has seen Matthew's response, talking about violence, talking about fulfillment of prophecy. And Luke decides in his telling of the story that Jesus should directly respond, not to kind of talk about the dangers of violence for the person who perpetrates it, but Jesus should specifically and directly intercede on behalf of the offended person, that he stops the violent act and heals the enslaved person. I think that's really, really interesting when you think about how Luke, as an author, thinks about or confronts slavery and enslaved characters. That marks this story, this version of the story, as very different than Mark, which has the story of the assault and then nothing else. And very different than Matthew, which has the story of the assault and then gives you kind of an almost unconnected chat about how violence is dangerous and his Jesus' own kind of fulfillment of prophecy. Luke has Jesus heal the slave, which is very interesting. Yeah, I think that's actually a really helpful way of thinking about why Luke tells the story this way, because it is maybe easiest kind of from a older consensus apologetic type of view to say, see, Jesus heals the slave. This is Jesus looking out for the enslaved person, and maybe connecting this back to kind of Jesus' first kind of sermon or first message in Luke, which is about freedom for the captives, which is this, this idea that in Luke, Jesus' gospel is for the poor and the oppressed, and including the enslaved in that narrative, which I think overall Luke does not. That overall Luke talks about enslaved persons similarly to the way Matthew does, the way Mark does, and the way that kind of the Roman world at large does. Looking at this story from the perspective of not the kind of compassion towards the enslaved person, but looking at Jesus' relationship with that person's owner or master. Jesus seeing this assault as kind of an attack on or disrespect towards the high priest, and how he responds to that, I think is maybe a more helpful way of understanding what's happening there. So I do appreciate that point. So let's look just for a minute at John's version, and we'll kind of spend very little time on this since this is a Synoptics course, and I want to make sure we get to some of our other texts at least. So in John, John is always very different. The first part of this story in John includes a number of kind of instances where Jesus refers to himself as I am, and people throw themselves on the ground, and it's very odd. But when we get to the kind of the assault on the slave, John has this. Then Simon Peter, so this is finally we have a name connected to this person, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. And Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back in its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So John does add a few details to the story, and just seems to respond to the assault maybe similarly to what Matthew does, instead of what Mark or Luke does. And we'll look kind of briefly at John before we conclude. I don't want to spend too much time with John because of the synoptic nature of the course. So let's look at a miracle story that has been mentioned already. We saw just a little part of the Lucan version of this story. So this is the healing of the centurion slave from Matthew 8. It's also in Luke 7, which is often used in kind of New Testament studies that are dependent on these older consensus ideas, or that are trying to reinforce some of these older consensus ideas to demonstrate something of the kind of feelings of goodwill between the enslaver and the enslaved. A lot of times, if you read kind of commentaries on this story, you will see the centurion described as someone who is kind of looking out for the well-being of this enslaved character. So we want to take some time to look at this story and then its Lucan counterpart. to see, again, what does this story actually tell us about slavery? What does it actually say without us trying to fill in the blanks? And then how does that kind of conform to or deviate from this kind of more, the new consensus social definitions that talk about slavery as coercive in different ways. So we have Matthew 8, starting in verse 5. It says, "When he entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, appealing to him and saying, 'Lord, my servant,'" now I bracketed this. All the translations that I've given you are from the NRSV, which generally speaking does really well, I think, translating slave vocabulary. Here it is a term other than doulos, which it's a term pais. It has variable meanings. I think in this case, probably better to translate it as slave than servant, but I'm running short on time, so I can't dive into that a ton right now. So I have it bracketed. It is another term that can be translated as slave, and I think in this case should be. But the NRSV has servant. "Lord, my servant or slave is lying at home paralyzed in terrible distress. And he," Jesus, "said to him, 'I will come and cure him.' The centurion answered, 'Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word, and my servant or slave will be healed. For I am also a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and the slave does it.' When Jesus heard him, he was amazed, and said to those who followed him, 'Truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west, and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown to the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.' And the centurion said, and to the centurion, Jesus said, 'Go, let it be done for you according to your faith.' And the servant or slave was healed in that hour." So again, like I said, a lot of times readings of this story in biblical studies and commentaries will talk about how much the centurion cared for this enslaved individual. But what does the text actually say about that enslaved person? There's very little that it says about the enslaved person or why the centurion comes to Jesus. Do we see anything specific about slavery in this text? Yeah, for sure. So that detail about the kind of distress being felt by the slave might denote some kind of level of connection or concern for the slave's state. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That's one of the things that jumps out to me in this passage is, and a lot of commentaries will almost gloss over this. They'll say, there's a change from talking about soldiers to talking about slaves, but it's really meaningless, they say, to what the point that the centurion's trying to make. But I don't know that it's meaningless, because what we have here is Matthew kind of giving the centurion a voice, kind of demonstrating how he understands this relationship should operate. That I say to my slave, do this, and it happens. So this centurion seems to have an understanding of kind of his relationship to this person or these people who he has enslaved, and their task or their job is to obey him without question. He should say do it, and they should do it, and that's it. So we have the kind of the broad relationship of master to enslaved person kind of defined in microcosm here as a relationship in which one should give orders and the other should follow them. So we do have, and I lost names in my list here, sorry, but so it has been pointed out at the very beginning, this detail of the enslaved person being in terrible distress may indicate some level of kind of compassion for that individual or concern. But then also we have kind of in the middle this characterization of the slave-master relationship as a relationship that is largely one-sided. The master says do, and it's done. And then the details that follow on about many coming from east and west, those are really interesting in the context of Matthew as a whole, but not something that we really need to worry about today with our limited focus. Compare that a little bit to Luke's version, which has some interesting differences. It says, after Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly, and who was ill and close to death. I want to pause there for a second. That's really interesting because we have in Luke, like we mentioned before, at the tail end of Luke, Jesus healing a slave. We have in Luke now this specific story where Luke tells us that this centurion valued this slave highly. So we may have another hint at kind of a positive relationship, if we could say that, between an enslaved person and their master or owner. And really, in a lot of ways, the story carries on very similarly to what we have in Matthew. But I want to point out, because I think this is a really kind of an interesting, what's the best way to say it? It's an interesting Greek phrase. So the phrase that the NRSV translates valued highly is the Greek word entimos. Its kind of root is the word time, which can mean honor or esteem, but it can also mean value or price, like the monetary value of a thing or an item. So when Luke tells us that the centurion has a slave whom he valued highly, this could mean the centurion has a slave who he esteemed highly, who he thought highly of, or it could mean a centurion had a slave who was costly, who cost him a lot of money, that represented a kind of large financial investment. It could be translated either direction. And that really changes the way we think about this story, the way we think about Luke's version, at least, of this story and what it might say about the slave-master relationship. I don't know that there is a way to decide which is correct, which is the correct way to understand this Greek term. I will tell you that Luke only uses it one other time in the gospel. The second time, it seems to refer to honor or esteem. It talks about, it's a parable about don't take the really high place at the table. That's a great question, Mary. I'll come right back to that. In the Vulgate, in Jerome's translation of the Bible, where he translates this text into Latin, Latin, I do not believe, and I could be corrected by the folks in the room who know more Latin than I do, I do not know that Latin has a term like time that means both kind of honor or esteem and kind of monetary value or price. It has terms like pretium, which means like monetary value or price, and it has words like honor or honoratus, which means like esteemed or honored. And it's very interesting to me that in this case, when he translates this story from Luke into Latin, Jerome chooses the term that means monetary value. That is his what's the best word for that? Interpretation of this text. That is how he chooses to read the text. That doesn't mean that that is the right way. But it is interesting to me that that kind of early commentary, more or less, on this text seems to read this as saying the centurion has a slave who represented a large financial investment and was close to death. Mary asked in the chat if it couldn't mean both. Can both meanings be in view here? Could it mean that the slave has a centurion who is both highly esteemed and also worth a lot of money? I think that's plausible. It seems like in this case, one of those would be emphasized over the other. But it is entirely possible that both of them are in view. And I don't think that there is a way that we could know. But what I do think is this helps us to see there are multiple ways to read this text, where the kind of standard way in New Testament studies has been kind of accepting this older consensus view to say, look, we have a highly valued slave, a highly esteemed slave, and the centurion goes to Jesus, or sends people to Jesus in this case, because of the great concern that he feels for this enslaved person. And that is not the only way to read this text. You could skeptically read this text as saying the centurion has a slave who is worth a lot of money to him, who is about to die, and because of the great financial investment he has made, sends people to Jesus in order to kind of return that enslaved person to work because he does say later on that is the slave's task. I should give orders, he should do them. So that both readings are plausible based on what we see in the text. This text does not say 100% this is a good relationship, a positive kind of mutual relationship. It doesn't say that it's specifically coercive. It allows for both possibilities, which is kind of the thing I would like to emphasize. That is a very good question, though, Mary. I like that question a lot. Because we are running close to 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock or whatever time zone everybody's in, and I do want to make sure that we have time to circle back to the question about how does this, what does this mean kind of currently in our current moment in the world. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit. We will look at this parable in Mark, but then I'll probably skip the ones from Luke because they're interesting, but I think that they're not quite as interesting as this one. So in Mark and also in Matthew and Luke, we're not going to look at the parallels because they are pretty similar to this. We have this parable, which is called the parable of the tenants or the parable of the wicked husbandman, depending on what translation you might be looking at. And the parables are a really important source for when we think about looking at slavery in the Synoptics. I mentioned at the outset that there are 21 unique pericopes in the Synoptics that deal with enslaved characters or the image of slavery. Of those 21 pericopes, 10 of them are parables. So nearly half of the kind of mentions of enslaved characters or slavery in the Synoptics are in parables. So this is one of them. It is in all three of the Synoptics. Mark's version reads like this. Then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. I should point out that the tenants here are not enslaved persons, according to the text. They could be, but the text does not specifically say they are enslaved. And I mention that because a lot of the articles or other biblical studies works that deal with parables specifically will talk about this as a servant parable or a slave parable, but they will identify the tenants as the servants. The tenants are not slaves as best we can tell. So he leased it to tenants and went to another country. Picking up verse 2, when the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. There's our slave. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. And then the story kind of ends. Jesus says, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read the scripture? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it's amazing in our eyes. And they realized the parable, or he had told this parable against them and wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds. So they left him and went away. So back up to the kind of body of the text. We have these slaves who are sent as kind of emissaries from the owner of the vineyard to these tenants. Somebody tell me what happens to them. What is their kind of work environment like here? Insults and injury are a couple things. What else? Yes, this is a really good point. So they're sent as emissaries or as messengers to collect this kind of agreed upon portion of the harvest. And they are mistreated, whether, and I really like what you said, whether this is a sign that they disrespect the messengers themselves, or whether this is supposed to be taken as a sign or as an indication that they disrespect not the slaves themselves, but the slaves' owners, as the enslaved persons are kind of sent with their master's authority or in their master's name, that this attack against the enslaved characters is kind of in a certain way an attack against the person whom they were kind of sent by, which I think is a really helpful point. Yeah, Justin, go ahead. That is a really interesting question. There are a lot of ways to, I think, read this text, but that is a fairly common, I would say, a way to interpret what's going on in this parable. It's one of the kind of irritating things about Jesus' parables, that he very rarely explains them nicely. But that is a fairly common understanding, that the son of the parable is often taken to be Jesus, and so the messengers, the enslaved messengers, are often taken to be the prophets, who are, as we read the prophetic text, often mistreated by the people who they have come to speak with also. That's an interesting, that's something that is often said, and there is kind of a connection between referring to these characters in the parable as enslaved and the kind of Hebrew Bible prophetic tradition in which the prophets are often called the slaves of the Lord. The question as to whether or not that should be understood as a kind of privileged position, I think is not dissimilar to asking questions like, should we understand Musicus Scaranus, the slave of Tiberius, to be a privileged individual? Because in some ways, his high placement in the imperial bureaucracy did grant him certain privileges. In other ways, we know that people who were enslaved and given those high positions were still vulnerable and were still enslaved. I mean, they were still, even though they were elevated to a high position in some ways, they still were kind of denigrated in other ways. So this idea of the prophets, and I mean, it goes on and on. Paul is a slave of God, or slave of Christ. This idea of being a slave of the divine is a really interesting metaphor that comes up again and again, and may, in some ways, emphasize, because you are a slave of God, you have this high position. But it may also metaphorically be meant to emphasize your, complete devotion to, complete obedience to, and also kind of representative of the divine party. But it is an interesting point. That is a really, really interesting point. And you mentioned the three that are specifically mentioned. So, the first, the second, the third. But look at what they say after the third one is sent and is killed. The second half of verse 5, and so it was with many others. Some they beat and others they killed. So in Mark's telling of the story, it's not just 3 slaves that are sent. When the third slave is sent and is killed, the response is, just send more. And some of those they beat and some of those they killed. None of them are treated well. And I think that you're right that in, I think at least maybe the most skeptical, but I think kind of a fairly plain reading of this text is that it is only after the son is killed that there is kind of a more harsh or a more severe response, which is, I think, very interesting, and I think fits with kind of the portrayal of ancient slavery that we see in these kind of social definitions, that to be a slave in the ancient world was to kind of live in a state of perpetual dishonor, that attacks against your person, violations of your body were fine. It was okay for people to do that to you, except in as much as it represented an attack on the free master. But it is only when, as you pointed out, it's only when they attack and kill the son that there is kind of a real response against these tenets, where they are going to be seized and thrown out and killed themselves. So I would love to look at more parables and a couple other things, but I want to be conscious of our time. I think we have 11 minutes left. Am I correct about that? I see Megan nodding. So I will skip past a few things. There are some really cool parables in Luke 15, 16, and 17 especially that deal with slavery that we'll just skip. I have said several times that the parable in Luke 16 has a verse that should be every doctoral student's kind of core verse for life, that says, "Woe is me, my master is about to take my position away. I am too weak to dig and too ashamed to beg," which is basically what it means to finish a doctoral program. Luke 17 also is a really interesting story. We have a number of times that slavery is brought up metaphorically in the Gospels. So you have heard in the Sermon on the Mount, no one can be a slave to two masters. The verbal form of the slave word shows up there. Jesus, you can see here on the screen in Matthew 10, talks about a slave is not above his master. There's the fairly well-known teaching of Jesus that we should be slaves of one another or slaves of all. So that terminology is always very interesting to me. But we don't have time for that, so let's get rid of that. I will just briefly tell you, and there's a lot of places that slavery shows up. The Magnificat, briefly before the Magnificat, I am the slave of the Lord, let it be with me as you have said. In the Nunc Dimittis, Sovereign Lord, let your slave depart in peace according to your word. All of these things come up. In John, I will mention just briefly, slavery shows up in a very, very different way. In John, we do not have the healing of the centurion's slave. There's the healing of the official's son, which is somewhat paralleled, but obviously different. In John 8, we have the idea of being a slave to sin, which doesn't show up in the Synoptics anywhere. That's a much more Pauline idea. In John 13, we have this same idea that I just scrolled past. The slave is not greater than his master. But in the Synoptics, that seems to show up in Matthew specifically, to say that a slave should expect to be mistreated like the master is. But in John, it shows up in more of a kind of imitation of Christ type way. It says, you should do as I have done. In John 15, Jesus says, I no longer call you slaves, I call you my friends, which is very different from anything we see in the Synoptics, but similar to something we saw in Cicero. I'm glad that we have Tiro as a friend and not as a slave. So lots of interesting things. So what? This brings us back to the question of our kind of current cultural moment. What ultimately is the harm in understanding these as servants, as these older ideas of slavery that say slavery in the ancient world wasn't so bad? Why does it matter to modern scholars or to pastors, priests, or parishioners, people in congregations, that the biblical slaves were individuals who were trapped in a violently abusive system that stripped them of power and agency and humanity? Why is it important for us to see these slaves for who they were? This is, I think, a very relevant question in the U.S. I think that it is hard for me to overstate the importance of recognizing the biases that are implicit in these texts that as often as not took for granted the institution of slavery in the ancient world, that took for granted the violence that is perpetrated against the enslaved, and to read past these biases, to ignore these biases, only serves to perpetuate them in certain ways, particularly in our time and place, where the legacy of slavery is still present and where racism is very much a live issue. And to demonstrate that, I just want to circle back to one thing I've read before and then read something that we haven't heard yet. I read this right at the beginning, but slavery represents the polar opposite of everything laudable in Greco-Roman civilization, an abomination for which no apology is possible and in which no redeeming features can be found. Now compare that to this, which was written in 2016 in a peer-reviewed theological journal by an established New Testament scholar. He wrote, I would like to suggest that slavery should be studied in light of the ancient evidence and New Testament depictions of that institution. I can get behind that. Instead of, as so often happens, dismiss it out of hand or labor under the impression that slavery as such is utterly incompatible with Christian beliefs and values. He quotes Richard Horsley there. Indeed, he says, New Testament slavery is compatible with Christian beliefs still today, as I hope overwhelmingly to demonstrate. This was 4 years ago. And although this author, who I hesitate to name, talks a good game, I mean, his desire to study the ancient evidence, I think, is a helpful approach. He reaches his conclusion about ancient slavery by ignoring outright the best scholarship available, works by Finley and Patterson and Bradley, which we've already mentioned, additional works by other modern historians like Sandra Joshua and Lauren Hackworth Peterson, works on slavery in the New Testament by Richard Horsley and James Harrell and Jennifer Glancy and Mitzi Smith and Ronald Charles and a number of other people whose names I would be happy to give you. Our own kind of brief survey of the slave texts in the Synoptics portrayed enslaved persons as compelled to unquestioning obedience and, much worse, subject to violence. So how such an institution could be called compatible with Christian beliefs in the modern decade is truly beyond my comprehension. But this is not an uncommon view, because New Testament scholars are still, in a lot of ways, dependent on a 40-year-old model. So I want to suggest in our last couple minutes that the way a person confronts the slave texts in the New Testament and the way a person confronts the deep injustices in our own world may be connected. Perhaps a willingness to look for and to risk finding these types of injustices like ancient slavery, within the biblical text is an important step towards recognizing and addressing similar injustices in our own world, at least for the segment of our population for whom these texts are meaningful. And to turn that around, I think it is possible and even maybe likely that the same impulse to stubbornly refuse to recognize the presence of an oppressive system like slavery in the biblical texts may be connected to, may contribute to the refusal to recognize and address those systems that are at work in our own society. What it comes down to, I think, is a willingness to look beyond privilege and to see suffering and oppression. As a Bible scholar, am I willing to look beyond the privilege of the free authors of the biblical texts and see the brutal injustices of ancient institutional slavery? And speaking for myself, now in the modern world, as we can consider the world around us, am I willing to look beyond my own privilege and see and address the brutal injustices of institutional racism, which seem to be built into the structures of our country, our society? Dr. Steve Davison, who's at McCormick Theological Seminary, gave a very helpful talk during the SBL's Black Scholars Matter event in August. And he said something that I really appreciated, because he says, I know these are the things that must be done, but he said, I am not yet sufficiently courageous to do them. But I think that these are important steps. Being able to recognize the privilege that exists in these texts and to look beyond that and see injustice is a habit that we would do well to adapt as we read Scripture and also as we kind of look at the world around us. So we only have 3 minutes left, and I apologize for all the things we had to cut out and for leaving so little time to discuss this, which I think it would be a very interesting discussion. But in that time, are there questions that people would like to ask, or Dr. Lupier, are there things that you want to add as we wrap up? Either or. If you have questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. There's a very, very good book that came out last month that I would really recommend. It's by an individual who teaches at Wheaton, I believe. He also just concluded a class at Nashotah House. Reverend Dr. Esau McCauley wrote a book called Reading While Black, African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope. And it is excellent and addresses some of those types of questions, particularly how African American Christianity has grown in spite of those texts being kind of leveraged by white supremacists in this country. He gives us it's a really brilliant thing he says at the beginning. He says, like Jacob wrestling with God, we have this choice that we're going to wrestle with these texts and not let go until they give us a blessing, which I think is very, very, that's the 10-minute you should stop talking thing. So it's a very good book, Esau McCauley, Reading While Black. It's very good and addresses some of those types of issues. I don't want to keep people who have other places to be. I'm perfectly happy to stick around for a little while and chat. But Dr. Lupier, if you want to wrap things up for your course, and then like I said, my time of holding you captive is done. So.